Hello, everyone. I'm Harvey Brownstone, and today's guest is a legendary four-time Grammy Award winning guitarist whose brilliant musicianship can be heard on thousands of recordings and on over 100 gold records recorded by the greatest stars of all time, including Barbra Streisand, Peggy Lee, Sammy Davis Jr., Quincy Jones, Michael Jackson, Diana Ross, Olivia Newton-John, Dolly Parton, and dozens more. His list of milestones in a career spanning over 50 years is staggering. For over 3 decades, before transitioning completely to a solo artist, he was one of the most sought-after studio musicians in the recording industry because he's equally adept on the electric and acoustic guitar in every musical genre, including pop, jazz, rock, R&B, blues, soul, and country. He's renowned for his unmistakable and often imitated sweet sound created on his famous Gibson ES-335 electric guitar. He created his trademark volume pedal technique, prominently featured in his recordings with Joni Mitchell and with the legendary jazz rock group The Crusaders, with whom he toured until 1976 and performed on 13 of their albums. He was a member of the iconic jazz band 4Play and recorded 8 albums with them. His performance on the theme from Hill Street Blues won him a Grammy Award, and he co-wrote the theme for the hit TV sitcom Who's the Boss and the movie soundtrack for Against All Odds. His guitar work on Steely Dan's classic song Kid Charlemagne was ranked by Rolling Stone magazine as one of the greatest guitar licks of all time. His solo career has been hugely successful with over 30 albums and 14 video concerts produced so far. The National Academy of Recording Arts and Sciences voted him their most valuable player for 3 consecutive years. And then he was given their highest honor. He was named Player Emeritus. I am beyond thrilled to welcome the one and only Larry Carlton to our show. Larry, thank you so much for joining us.
Hey, buddy, this will be great. Thank you.
Larry, you started playing guitar when you were 6 years old, and your first professional gig was at a supper club when you were only 14. I know that B.B. King and John Coltrane were instrumental in motivating you as a musician, but who were some of your other musical influences?
Yeah, Harvey, guitar-wise, definitely Joe Pass. I was in junior high school and I was getting interested in jazz. And prior to hearing Joe, I had bought some albums. My mom bought my albums for me. Barney Kessel, Johnny Smith. These are legendary guitar players. And as a kid, they touched me. And I would sit in my bedroom and just try to emulate what they were doing. And then one day on the radio, the jazz station after junior high school, I heard Joe Pass playing with the Gerald Wilson Big Band, an album called Moment of Truth. I had never heard anybody play jazz guitar like that. So continued inspiration from these legendary guys that I related to as a kid.
You went on tour with the Fifth Dimension in 1968, and you worked on one of their albums in 1973. We've had 3 members of that group on our show, Florence LaRue, Marilyn McCoo, and Billy Davis Jr. Can you share some memories of working with them, Larry?
Yeah, I was in college for the 68 tour, and I'm not even sure how they got my name. So I toured this summer with them, and that was the summer that Up and Away, I believe, was their big hit. Like I say, I was just a kid and happy to go on tour with a known group. And I don't remember what session I did. In fact, I hadn't thought that I had played on a Fifth Dimension record, but obviously I did. You have my bio there. So I was a fan before ever getting to play with them, you know, so it just worked out great that I got to do that and later record.
Larry, you had enormous success for a very long time as a studio musician, but I read that you didn't really love being a session player. Is that right?
In my teen years, up until I was about 20 years old or so, I really had no aspirations to be a studio musician. I wanted to be like my heroes, sit in smoky jazz clubs and play the guitar. But that's not the way it worked out. Somehow my name kept coming up with groups that would be in the studio. So once I got in to the studio saying, no, I loved it. It was a joy. And I've always said, I got to play with some of the best musicians in the world every day, which as a young, early 20s guy playing the guitar was invaluable. I grew and grew and grew as a musician.
Did you ever? I mean, really, Larry, when I look at your body of work, I don't know if there's any other musician in history who's worked with as many incredibly brilliant music artists as you. And I only barely scratched the surface in my introduction. Has it ever occurred to you that your work is probably found in at least one album in every single record collection in every home in the world?
I never thought of it, Harvey, that way, but I think it's possible that a high number of albums in somebody's collection, I would be on one of those, especially from my genre, 70s, 80s, into the 90s.
When you were working on albums being recorded by superstar vocalists, how often were you in the studio at the same time as them?
Sometimes, but not all of the time. And obviously, as a sideman in the studio for all of us, it's much easier to come up with a part if the singer is there and you're hearing their voice and hearing the melody of the song. But sometimes they weren't there. It was just a chart. So you find ways as a guy to stay out of the way of a melody that you don't know is going on, but still have the guitar contribute to the track.
I want to mention some of my favorite recording artists and ask you about your memories of working with them or on their music. Let's start with Barbra Streisand. You made 5 albums with her. What was she like to work with?
I had heard stories that she was difficult to work with from some producers and arrangers. But for me, it was just, they expected me to come in and come up with the guitar parts like I would. And so she was a joy. And I had the opportunity to actually arrange 4 rhythm tracks for her on the Superman album. And yeah, I met with her at her house. I know it. I showed up at her house with the producers and we sat in her living room for about 30 minutes waiting for Babs to come down from her room to have the meeting. But the sessions went smooth. I enjoyed playing with Barbra.
That makes me so happy because I just adore every single one of her albums and I adore her. And I'm very glad to hear you say that. You played on Michael Jackson's song, She's Out of My Life, from his Off the Wall album. You played at the request of Quincy Jones, who specifically wanted you. Even though you were not doing much session work at that time, that was quite an honor, wasn't it, Larry?
It was. The songwriter of She's Out of My Life, that's Tom Baylor. I had known Tom since 1970. And he called one day and he said, we've got this tune to finish Michael's album. And when Quincy and I, meaning Tom and Quincy, are now talking to each other, when they listened to it and thought, okay, what does it need? He flattered me and he said they looked at each other and said, let's get Carlton. So they knew that I would be right for that tune, which I was honored to come in and do. What a beautiful song. It's
a classic. It's a gorgeous song. It's one of the few ballads he did after going solo, and it's probably the best. How about Joni Mitchell? You made 5 albums with her too, including the monumentally successful and one of my favorite all-time albums, Court and Spark.
One of my favorite all-time albums also. I'll preface this by saying I was a Joni fan. When I heard her album Blue, ripped my heart out. And especially the song Green, I can remember hearing that song and just my little heart, it did something to me emotionally, like it did to most people that heard Joni. So yes, I was playing at the Baked Potato, a little small jazz club in Studio City, California, with Tom Scott and Max Bennett and Joe Sample and John Guerin on drums. And Tom knew Joni. And she came to the club one night when we were playing. I didn't even know she was there. And the story, the way I heard it from Tom Scott, was after she heard us play, she said, I think I'd like to go in the studio with you guys and just see what we come up with. And that's kind of casually how it happened. And she came in for Court and Spark with all those great songs. And it was terrific.
Well, I have you and her and everyone that worked on that album to thank, because in a way, I feel that our generation got our emotional education from people like Joni Mitchell and Carole King and Carly Simon and those women of that generation. And you're such a big part of that era. So I want to thank you.
Yeah, well, I was blessed to be involved in that kind of music at that time.
You worked on Billy Joel's Piano Man album. Can you tell us a little about that?
Yeah, I mean, again, it was just 1 or 2 sessions. And it's funny, I remember we recorded Piano Man, which you can't really hear the guitar on the track, but I played on the track, but the way they mixed it with the piano. But I do remember recording Piano Man on that session. But again, it could have been that I was only on 6 hours of recording. And then I wasn't there for the rest of the album. Maybe I was already booked.
That's probably the same thing with the wonderful Olivia Newton-John Soul Kiss album from 1985. Do you have any recollection of that one?
I can remember the session because it was an overdub, and her producer called me to do a guitar overdub on a song. Yeah, I just remember it being very smooth, very easy, and I just played some things, and I went home and the record came out and I could hear me.
Larry, after all the #1 songs you've been a part of, have you ever been able to figure out what is the key to making a hit record?
I just have my perception after being in the industry for so long. I think it starts with a great song. Great producers back in the day. I remember Jimmy Bowen, who I worked for many, many times, great producer. He said, the music industry is a song-driven industry. So you have to have the great song. And from there, matching a great song with the perfect artist. You know, I heard Quincy Jones in an interview one time say that producing an album is like producing a movie. A lot of it is about casting. The right players, the right arranger, the right producer, the right song for that artist. Put all those elements together and you have a better chance of having a hit record.
Now, this may be a totally unfair question, but do you have a favorite artist whose album you've worked on?
Oh boy, no, I don't. I know I have a couple. Obviously, Joni. Great, great record. All of those. I would say that Crusaders, because I was only 23 years old when I got invited to play with them. And I was a jazz Crusader fan in my teens. So to all of a sudden be in the studio with those guys and have it work like it did, one of my favorite memories for sure. And of course, Steely Dan. I mean, the success that we had together, it changed my career, being associated with those guys on that material, playing my guitar parts.
If I were to ask you about your biggest disappointment in working with a big star, would John Lennon be at the top of your list?
Yeah, I didn't tell that story, the one that you're probably recalling. It was a session for John Lennon, and the producer was Phil Spector. And there were a lot of us there who were well known as sidemen. I mean, I was there, Leon Russell was there, but we were all pros. So we would get to a session and expect it to start at some point and then make the music. And we sat around for over 3 hours at A&M Records waiting on John Lennon and Phil Spector to show up. And then when they finally showed up, I'm sad to say that John was inebriated. And we went out and cut one track, maybe played it twice. And I was booked for the whole week, every night for the whole week. And I was so disappointed and didn't want to sit around the studio waiting and waiting and waiting just to do something. So as soon as I got home, it was around midnight, I just called Phil Spector's office and said, sorry, I won't be able to make it the rest of the week. And the other part of that story is after the session, I drove Leon Russell back to his hotel And we were talking about what a drag it was to sit around like that. I said, Leon, I think I'm going to cancel the rest of the week. And Leon, with his Oklahoma drawl, he said, I'm back to Tulsa in the morning. And so he flew back home the next day. So we were disappointed that week on how those sessions went.
I think you got John Lennon at a time when he was temporarily separated from Yoko, I think.
Okay.
And that may be an explanation for why he was really off the rails. That's a real disappointment.
Yeah, it was a disappointment for me too, because I love his voice, love his songwriting, the whole bit. But yeah, it just didn't work that time.
Is there any great star that you wish you could have worked with, but never got the chance to?
Wow. I don't think so. Had you asked me that, because I only worked with the gentleman I'm going to mention now a couple of times, but had I not had the opportunity to do this a couple of times, it would have been on my bucket list of I wish I could have, and that's Ray Charles.
Oh, yeah.
Again, as a kid, I owned every Ray Charles album, and he could sing the phone book, as they say, and melt my heart. So yes, my friend Mike Post was producing an album for Ray, and I remember doing the sessions. At the end of one of the tunes, it was vamping. So the band was just vamping, and Ray was in the booth, but he had a microphone, and he was singing his licks, and I started answering his licks on my guitar. And we kept playing, and he came out from the booth into the studio and stood in front of me. And at the end of the sessions, he asked Mike Post, he said, who's that little guitar player? I want to work with him. So that was a real thrill for me.
What an honor, and what
Yes.
a credit to you. That's really, really something. You know, many music critics have said that it was during the time that you worked with the Crusaders that you developed your signature, highly rhythmic, often bluesy style of guitar playing. Do you agree?
Yes, I had just bought a volume pedal, which means I could strike my note on my guitar with the no volume, and then it would come in like crying. It would go. And I used that on a number of tunes because it worked with the Crusaders. And that was probably the first time people said, well, that's the Carlton sound.
I want to ask you now about your transition into becoming a solo artist, which was triggered by a CBS record executive who heard you playing in a club. I think it was Dante's in West Hollywood. He asked if you were interested in making a record. Do you think you would have had a solo career if you had not been approached by a record executive?
Well, I definitely was not looking for a solo career. I was just slowing down my studio work and decided to start playing like I did when I was a kid in clubs, just for fun. And that was just the circumstance where I was heard by an executive and said, do you want to make a record? Now, obviously, he had heard me. I had worked with Bruce Botnick. That was his name, A&R man. And he was a great engineer. And I had worked a few sessions over the years where he was the engineer. But yes, he said, would you like to make a record sometime? I said, sure, I haven't thought about it much. He said, well, I'll get a few dollars together from CBS and go in and do some demos. That's how it started.
On your second album, Singing, Playing, which is one of my favorites, it's from 1973. Wow. Mm-hmm. You sang 8 songs on that album as well as played guitar. Was that a challenge for you, Larry, to become a vocalist as well?
Well, in my teens, I played a lot of clubs 6 nights a week, and I was the lead guitar player and singer, leader of the band. So I did sing in my youth, and I always had a pleasant voice. I wasn't a great singer, but it was in tune and it was easy to listen to.
Yeah.
And I thought when I was making those records, if I would do 1 or 2 vocals, I was thinking that would enhance my live show. Break it up from the instrumentals all night and sing a tune or 2. And it was funny when I did my first 2 albums that way, 1 or 2 vocals on each record. And it was time for Warner Brothers to decide if they were going to pick up my option for 2 more albums. So I went to Warner Brothers for the meeting, and it was Mo Austin and Tommy LaPuma. And they said, we're going to pick up your option. We'd love for you to do a couple more albums for us, but don't sing. In other words, no, it was right. I could play guitar like this and then sing okay. They were being very smart. Just play, man. That's what you do the best. And so I signed for 2 more albums with Warner Brothers.
Your 1986 album, Alone But Never Alone, went to #1 on the US Billboard Jazz Chart. That's one of my favorite of all your albums as well, because of The Lord's Prayer and Whatever Happens with Bill Withers. Yeah. There was something really extraordinarily magical about that album, don't you think?
I do. I had never done an acoustic guitar album, so that was unique. And that was for MCA Master Series, a new label. And their concept for the label was let musicians do anything they want to do. And when they approached me, they said, you've done so much, maybe do something you've never done before. And I said, well, I've never made an acoustic guitar album. They said, well, then why don't you do that? It was that simple. So I started listening to what was then called the Quiet Storm radio format, because they were playing some instrumental music along with vocals. And then I started writing songs that I thought would fit that format. First time I've really given radio any consideration on my records. And yeah, it worked out well. Smiles and Smiles to Go became an instant hit. I still play it every night at my show.
Yeah, that's just a magical album. I already mentioned your Grammy Award for the Hill Street Blues theme, and you also won Grammys for Minute by Minute, which is on your Discovery album, and for the No Substitutions Live in Osaka album, and for the Take Your Pick album. In fact, Larry Carlton, you've received 19 Grammy nominations and you've won 4 Grammys. Tell us what it means to you to get this kind of recognition.
Well, I can say the obvious. I mean, it's wonderful, wonderful to be recognized for a project that you've worked on. And I would say the biggest effect career-wise of receiving a Grammy, for the next year or so, it kind of is impressive for all the promoters and all the magazines and interviews, for them to be able to say, Grammy Award winner, so-and-so. And so it really helps with that part of your career because you've been acknowledged in a certain area for that year. So yeah, honored for 19 nominations, my Lord. Who would thought?
I think it's amazing. And I think you're incredibly humble. I really, you know, the words legend and icon get thrown around a lot, but in your case, sir, that's an understatement. In 1992, you released your Kid Gloves album, which was the first time you included both acoustic and electric tracks in the same album. What inspired that decision?
It just kind of made sense, Harvey. The success of Alone But Never Alone, and then my consistency with the electric guitar success. It just seemed maybe it's time to just do both. Why just do one? And that was my first album for GRP Records. GRP had been bought, the label GRP had been bought by MCA. So I was assigned to GRP Records because I was on MCA. But anyway, yeah, I think it just was the timing of there's no reason not to do both. It doesn't have to be separated. And it was that simple.
Your Renegade Gentleman album from 1993 was the first time you recorded one of your own albums in Nashville. Does the location of where you record have any impact on the sound that you produce?
The majority of the Renegade Gentleman album was recorded at my studio in Hollywood. And then some of the tracks and overdubs to finish the album were done in Nashville because I had been using a couple of Nashville players, namely Terry McMillan on harmonica and Matt Rawlings on keyboards, and then the great Michael Rhodes on bass. So yeah, it was kind of fun to come to Nashville, be in a different studio with the Nashville locals, even though they had played with me in Los Angeles. And it was different. I was living in a hotel, obviously, as opposed to sleeping at home, all those little things. But the vibe was great when we did it, and great players.
Now, given the time of year, I have to mention your two Christmas albums. The first one is entitled Snowbound, which you recorded with Foreplay. And you also have an album called Four Hands and a Heart, Christmas. How did you go about selecting the songs for that album?
Yeah, Four Hands and a Heart was a concept for me to record an album alone. No other musicians, just solo acoustic guitar, but two acoustic guitars. Me on accompanying and me playing the melodies. So it was four hands, but all my heart. And I did arrangements that I thought would be cool for two guitars. And yeah, we still play that album here at the house at Christmas time. It's so easy to listen to and it's beautiful.
It's a perfect album, I think, when you're having a gathering of people over. It sets a tone and it creates instant warmth. And I love the fact that you're there with us.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
I know you're doing a lot of live shows, and I believe at one point you toured with Steely Dan. So I can't resist asking you this, Larry. Sure. What was it like to play your guitar solo from Kid Charlemagne live on the stage with Steely Dan?
It was terrific. When I got that call, maybe 8 years ago, something like that now, saying Steely Dan would like you to come guest on 6 or 8 shows with them live. I thought, how cool. I said, sure, that'd be great. And I hung up the phone and realized I hadn't played Steely Dan music in 35 years. But luckily for me, their wonderful, consistent guitar player, John Harrington, he knew all of my guitar parts. He knew all of the Steely catalog. So when I got there, John was there. But of course, before the shows, before I really had to go out on tour, I had the big decision. How do I play Kid Charlemagne live with Steely Dan? I had 2 choices. Play it the way I play guitar now, 35 years later, or do I go back and learn the iconic solo from the Royals camp? Asked a couple of friends. They said, Larry, you should learn the hit solo. They're going to want to hear that.
Yeah.
So I did. And we opened the show at the Beacon Theater, and I played the Kid Charlemagne solo note for note off the record like I did. And it was a huge success, and that worked. And since then, many of my shows, I'll talk about Steely Dan and play Kid Charlemagne and play the original solo. People love that. They love to hear it.
Of course they do. That's legendary. Larry, in 1988, you were the victim of a horrific random shooting outside your studio in Los Angeles.
Yeah.
You were shot in the throat. You suffered severe injuries, including nerve and vocal cord damage and paralysis of your left arm, which left you unable to play guitar for over 6 months at a time when your career was red hot. I can't even imagine the hell that you went through in the hospital and in rehab. How did you get through that terrible time in your life?
Yeah, that was 1988. I think we're all about the same when we go through something that's just that traumatic, all of us. You just have to get through it. You have no choice. So yeah, it was physical therapy 5 days a week for a couple of months. Again, as you mentioned, throat problems. I only have one vocal cord that functions. So when we're talking, if you hear me go, that's just the residue from 33 years ago of being shot in the throat. But yeah, it just, like all of us, we just do what we have to do to get through the trauma in our lives. And I'm very, very fortunate that it all worked out.
Thank God. You formed a nonprofit organization called Helping Innocent People to aid victims of random gun violence. And you've raised a lot of money for that organization. That's an amazing thing that you did, Larry.
Yeah, I was surrounded by some great people at that time that together we decided, well, how can we bring awareness? Because I was the victim of a random shooting. There was no intent to shoot Larry that day. I'm just Joe Citizen, and I happened to be the one that they pulled the trigger on and ran off. So yeah, for a few years there, we did concerts and donated the money to that organization. And then, of course, after a few years, it becomes time to decide, is that going to be my life, or is back to making music my life? But for a few years, it was very effective and brought awareness that there are innocent victims of violent crime out there that we only hear about once, but then they have to go through their recovery. The family has to go through it. Very traumatic, but I'm glad we did it.
I'm just so glad that you recovered. You were able to return to your music. Your heart is so full when you play. You convey so much warmth. And the fact that you were resilient enough to endure and overcome the incredibly serious injuries you had is such a testament to the strength of your spirit.
Well, thank you.
I want to tell our viewers that you can learn more about Larry Carlton, order his albums, and see his tour schedule by going to his official website, larrycarlton335.com. Well, Larry, it's been an immense honor having you on our show. I can't thank you enough for giving me this interview. I know how busy you are, and I greatly appreciate your time.
Harvey, thank you. And I just want to mention before we say bye-bye, my mother lives with me, and she's 100 years old this month.
God bless her.
Happy birthday to Mom, so I can share that with all of you. We've celebrated 3 different parties this month, so she's doing great, and I'm happy to be able to share that with you. And you did a great job, buddy. I really enjoyed this.
Well, I really enjoyed having you on the show. Your mother must be so proud of you, and we are all proud of her. And I hope she lives another 50 years.
Exactly. Thank you.
In good health. I wish you a very happy holiday season and a wonderful new year. And just please stay well. And thank you for all the joy you've brought us through your music.
Thanks, Harvey. You take care.
Our guest has been the extraordinarily brilliant musician, Larry Carlton. My name is Harvey Brownstone. Thank you to our producer, Steve Silver. Thank you to my wonderful management team in LA, Rick and Robin Marcelli of the Marcelli Company. Thank you to my team in UK. Thank you all for joining us. See you next time.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to check out all the great interviews on the Harvey Brownstone Interviews YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell to be notified when new videos are posted.